when I was a young boy, I used to go to my dad's town every weekend. Sometimes he would take me struggling, but we'd end up there every weekend. And it was about 3 hours from Delhi. And as many of you have probably experienced, the town used to get about 4 hours of power. Not only did it get 4 hours of power, we never knew when the power would come. And I would always ask my father, what's going on? Why is this the case? And of course, the major reason is that there just wasn't enough power. But why was it that it was so irregular and you never understood when it would come and why? And he told me that his classmate had now become the district electricity commissioner or something, and it was a very simple thing. Every week he would demand money from various industries, and whichever industry gave him the most money, that was the industry to which they wield the power. And at the times that those industries needed it. Which is why the actual people in the town would get very little power, and they would get power at very different times. And it was something that stuck with me because this sort of callousness of centralized delivery of services and how they effectively impact the last mile. And we certainly weren't the last mile. There were many more for whom that power was effectively zero. But it stuck with me, and I have grown up with this large amount of mistrust of centralized things. And so some of what you're going to hear today stems from that childhood mistrust of centralized delivery. So, what do these things have in common? You have an e-commerce platform that is trying to help artisans that are building things in their own home get onto the information superhighway. You have, famous example, Airbnb, that's literally not trying to get stuff in your home, but your home itself onto the information superhighway. You have Bitcoin, and we just heard about banking, which is trying to do away with banks whatsoever. FairCent is one of many organizations in the country and around the world that are also trying to get rid of banking and saying, well, you know what? You can lend to your friend. There doesn't need to be a bank in between. Mini-grids, people who are building water utilities in villages are doing away with the need for pipes and centralized delivery of these services, which frankly have never reached there. And even a funny example, which I think many in Bombay are quite used to, Ola Chef, which is effectively decentralizing something that is already felt very decentralized, right? We went from big community kitchens to local restaurants, but that's not good enough. Now you can pick food from people's kitchens. And this is an incredibly interesting space because what's happening is that we're really, in some sectors of the economy, we're rewiring it. It is not just the internet. I mean, this is a common way that people explain the internet of moving from centralized to decentralized to effectively a distributed model where everyone's networked. But that is not just what's happening on the internet. The physical economy in which you are living is also experiencing some of this. And it is high time that we realize that some of this is going on because it affects the way we should be thinking about policy for the future. What is the economic architecture we want to create should reflect on some of these changes. And the reason I'm talking about it, because it's something that many people have talked about. People talk about decentralization, they talk about devolution of power, they talk about the sharing economy. Why I'm going to speak to you about it is because I work on poverty alleviation, and it has a huge impact in the ability for those that are effectively off-center to become part of the centralized solutions. I mean, if you think about centralized delivery, one of the issues of centralized delivery is it's designed for those who are in the center. And the poor are off-center. So as you move towards some of these distributed models, there's an opportunity to start to deliver services and produce things in a way which is much more inclusive to those that we have traditionally left out. Now, the mainstream economy that we have today, this idea of large-scale, big factory production, getting economies of scale by getting lots of people together or machinery together, is not something that has been around for that long, right? I mean, if you go to 150 years ago, most of what was consumed, what was built, was done very locally, right? I'm just going to tell this story very swiftly through just shoes, for example, right? So this is early shoemaking shop in the US. Up till about 1812, all shoes were made by hand. And in 1812, a guy called Mark Engels basically invented a machine that started to make shoes by machine for the purposes of the army, right? And that then led to other improvements and so forth, and again, mechanization happened, and ultimately shoes started to be built at the end of the century through these means, right? And this is just a small-scale version of what happened on every product until you get to the 21st century, and this is how shoes are made, right? This is the economy that we either understand or aspire to, right? And we'll get into what does it mean when we talk about Make in India. Is this necessarily the model for each type of product that we want to create? Now, the reason I say this is quite new, and it's only 150 years ago, is because our social structures, our governance models, have not actually necessarily caught up to this very rapid change to high levels of scale. So you had, for me, three important factors that came into play. Number one is that you had the centralization of power, right? And the union movement, as we know it today, was in fact a large reaction to the industrialization and the movement towards large-scale factories. Because large-scale factories are not just large-scale production, they also centralize power in the hands of the few. And so you then had a huge amount of vulnerable blue-collar workers, and the union movement arose. Wherever you have centralization of power, the next thing you have is the centralization of corruption. It was quite interesting. I Googled rent-seeking, and I got a photo of pigs putting their snouts into a trough, which I thought was quite poetic of Google. And again, a description of what my parents and I were facing in the delivery of electricity, whereas electricity was being delivered centrally, there is a multitude of rent-seeking behavior that went along with it because our governance systems have not caught up to this. And that is exactly the story you see playing out in Russia, in China, and much of India, right? Our structures have not actually caught up to the economic scale and structure that we have built. But perhaps the most telling thing from the perspective of the poor is not just the rent-seeking behavior. It is that effectively they are the last ones to be served. If you are going for large-scale, high efficiency, the first people you serve are the ones that are the most efficient to serve. And generally, the most vulnerable population and the most poor population are the last ones to be served as a result. So we see this playing out everywhere. If you look at electrification, there are still, man on the moon in the 1960s, but still 1.2 billion people who have actually never experienced electricity in their homes. And many, many more, another 1 billion that are getting that 4 hours of power that I was talking about, which literally you have to go only 1 hour out of Bombay to experience again. Right? And it's not that they're not being served because they can't pay for it. In fact, they pay more than you do for electrification. They're paying over 20 billion for very poor forms of energy to make up for the fact that there's no electricity flowing through their wires. And this story is true for a multitude of services. We were just listening about banking. 40, 50% of the world's population doesn't actually have bank accounts. Right? And the bank accounts that they do have, and the ones that you may see the statistics of, there's really no money being transacted in them. So it's one thing to open a bank account, it's another to actually visit the bank and use it. So there's a huge, how many banks really want to set up operations in far-flung places? A centralized model of banking services is always going to leave those people in rural areas last, and those with the least amount of money to invest. In any other field, water, 630 million people lack access to clean water. That's a staggering statistic in the 21st century. And women and children spend 125 million hours each day collecting water. It's not that they can't afford it. Think about the time value of money, even if you put a modest amount for their hourly time. It's an enormous amount of money and investment that's going on to get something that's more expensive than what you have to pay for because it's coming out of your taps. And again, it's because our whole architecture around water delivery has largely been a centralized one. And even if you look at cooking, it's only around 35% of the world's population that actually has access to pipe gas or LPG. And in fact, there are huge health issues that are related to the fact that they don't have this access and are therefore using wood and other very unclean sources of fuel. So centralized delivery models have also resulted in many of the services that we take for granted not actually being delivered to the poor. I mean, of course, there's a huge democratization of luxury. Things have become cheaper. Many of the things that you'll see in museums that only the rich could afford, you now can buy from IKEA. And so there's been a huge benefit in things coming down in prices, although there are many other TED Talks around whether that has actually ever made us happier. But there has been a huge benefit from this scale. So I'm only going through some of the disadvantages that we need to sort of consider. But change is afoot. There are three things that I want to talk about which I think are making things very exciting around changing this equation and bringing some new things to bear for the poor especially. One is that we know that scale is coming down. This is a well-told story. Technology is driving down costs. Information is free. The store of information and who had it was a big part of why certain scale economies work. But now, everyone can access a lot of information. Separate but related point, we are networked. And so we're getting into a stage where, because we are networked, people who are on the periphery can actually access a lot of the things in the center. And finally, we are increasingly interested in the narrative. Before, product differentiation was all about the fact that this had an extra button or this had a larger engine. Increasingly, consumers are actually differentiating between products based on what is the narrative behind it. Let me take you through some very quick examples. I mean, I think this one, very well known, that fundamentally, this incredible change that has happened in terms of computing power, transistors, anything to do with technology, is driving scale down phenomenally. So the idea that you need to still have very large-scale production for everything is no longer true. You've gone from the 1990s for $500 per 1 million transistors to 0.05 cents. So what does it matter that in my computer, which is much smaller than a very large-scale computer, it's costing 10 cents? It's no longer material. And that has really helped drive down the scale of machinery. Farmers, anyone out there who has a smartphone now has more information on tap than PhD students at the best universities did 20, 30 years ago, right? And this is a huge democratization of information that is allowing access. And finally, we care about the narrative. Care about the narrative of products. Seva, a very well-known organization in India, a women's collective, is no longer trying to just say, hey, have a sewing machine, right? And we'll help you earn a little bit of money from a sewing machine. They're saying, look, our people are artisans, and our artisans need to be connected to the global supply chain. And they're selling a narrative. You can go onto the site and you'll see wonderful stories about where is these products being made. And that narrative means actually that they're charging a higher price. So consumers are more and more interested in the narrative. Now, all of these three things, they're not all present together in every model, but each of these trends is changing the nature of delivery, which is making it exciting for how we can address some of the issues of the poor. Why is this important? Because for many of the poor, large industrialization still has not happened. And people still make things with their hands. What I showed you was a picture of the 1850s in the US. This is a picture of today in parts of our country. And this is no longer about the fact that this person did not go through industrialization. It is about recognizing that this person is producing with their hands, has skills, and is just lacking a connect to the supply chain, which they now have. And it's a big issue. Within India, there are several 100 million people who actually earn their livelihoods by making things at home using small-scale machinery. You cannot relegate these people to very low-income supply chains or niche products. There is an economy out there in the future, given the changes in scale and people's tastes, that says, actually, we should be able to wire all of these different people up and compete against a factory. It cannot all be about high-end products and so forth. You cannot absorb that weight of gravity of several 100 million people. You have to think about models that are not simply about shifting them all into a factory. Because there is an interesting change that is going on. You want to not just consume something that every other person is consuming. You want to be able to say this was made by hand. You want to recognize that person's artisanship. And it creates much greater levels of equity. Similarly, mini-grids are popping up all over India, parts of Africa, where electricity has never reached. If you look at any other models, Snapdeal, as an example, is actually, along with many of the other e-commerce platforms, and Alibaba in China, are bringing SMEs and people in their homes online. They've completely surpassed scale. These are people that had no access outside the 1 kilometer radius of where they built. And they're putting these artisans online, and again, essentially rewiring the economy. Lending Club in the US has lent over $18 billion. And that is just peer-to-peer lending. Forget banks. Again, no need for a central authority. Now, in villages where we learned that there was disruption going on and banks were finding it hard to go to, can these models surpass what banks have been doing? Are banks really going to be relevant in a very decentralized economy? So what does this mean? What does it mean to make in India? To me, the question is, where should you make it, and for whom? This idea that a make in India is only about SEZs, industrial corridors, is outdated. It is not to say that these things are going to become the economy. This is only going to work for some parts of some sectors. But we still have to take cognizance of the fact that technology is changing, our norms are changing, and as we think about industrialization in this country, we have to really take into account this fundamental rewiring away from the center. So the question I would ask you, and the question I would ask us when we have these debates, is do our policies actually embrace this or not, or are we still embracing a centralized model? It does not have to go like this. This is the model that has happened over the last 150 years, and now it's reversing. In some ways, the whole hipster movement is a reversal of this with the idea of localized and artisanship. And again, the question is, does the industry step have to be one that is highly centralized, or can it be decentralized? And I guess a final comment. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done to think about the equity aspects of this, right? Trickle down has rarely worked. And my observation to you is it may be easier to trickle down if the stream is next door versus if you have a dam that's hundreds of kilometers away. And I think that is what decentralization can really do for the poor. Thank you.